Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Gregory Campbell.
Number one, sir.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in paying tribute to all those involved in the start of the Tour de France in Britain. From the event organisers to all the great cyclists, I think this event showcased the best of Yorkshire and the whole of Britain has to offer, and I was delighted to see such incredible support throughout the race. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We join with the good news that the Prime Minister has just relayed. The Northern Ireland Equality Commission is threatening legal action against a family-owned bakery because they wouldn't print a political message on a cake. The requested message was completely at variance with the company's Christian values. Does the Prime Minister agree that so-called equality is now being viewed by many as an oppressive threat to religious freedom? And does he further agree that such freedoms should be protected by the introduction of a conscience clause?
I'm not aware of the specific case that the honourable gentleman raises, and of course I'll go away and have a look at it. But I do think a commitment to equality, in terms of racial equality, in terms of equality to those of different sexes, equality in terms of people who have disabilities, or indeed tolerance and equality of people who with different sexualities, all of that is a very important part of being British.
Mrs. Caroline Spellman.
Prime Minister like to welcome the President.
I want the question to be heard. I want all questions to be heard. Mrs. Spellman.
Would the Prime Minister welcome the President, MPs and choir of the German Parliament who have come to sing a joint concert with our Parliament choir in Westminster Hall tonight to commemorate the centenary of the First World War and the tercentenary of the Hanoverian monarchy?
I'm very happy to join my right honourable friend in welcoming this German choir. I suspect after last night's results they'll be rather in good voice, I think. But I think it is important, on a serious note, that we properly commemorate the outbreak of the First World War, the key battles of the First World War, and, of course, Armistice Day, as we come up to these vital 100th anniversaries. And I'm absolutely determined that in Britain we'll mark it in appropriate ways. There'll be a service in Glasgow and then a number of different events. And I think it's very important that we learn the lessons of that conflict and we commemorate those that fell.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the way that the organisers, cyclists and the millions of fans made the Tour de France such a brilliant success for Britain. I was proud to be watching it on the streets, as I know he was. I was in Leeds with hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets. Let me say, Mr. Speaker, all of us have been horrified by the instances of child abuse that have been uncovered and the further allegations that have been made. And all of the victims of child abuse are not just owed justice, but are owed an apology that it took so long for their cries to be heard. Does the Prime Minister agree that all inquiries, including by the police and those he has set up, must go wherever the evidence leads them, in whatever institution of the country, including our own, to get at what happened?
Prime Minister.
I absolutely agree with the right honourable gentleman. Child abuse is a despicable crime, and the victims live with the horror for the rest of their lives. And it's absolutely vital that whether it is the 2 inquiries announced by the Home Secretary or indeed the vital police inquiries that are being carried out, that no stone is left unturned. I think the horror of the Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris cases just show what people were able to get away with. It was almost on occasion they were committing crimes in plain sight, and it took far too long to get to the bottom of what happened and for justice to be done, and that is absolutely what this government is committed to achieving.
Ed Miliband.
Speaker, on the issue of the 114 missing files at the Home Office, can the Prime Minister clarify when ministers were first informed about this and what action they took? And does he agree that the review by Peter Wanless cannot be simply a review into the original review, but must seek to discover what happened to the files, who knew what about the files, and whether information was covered up, and the Wanless review must also have full investigative powers?
Well, first of all, it was a parliamentary question last October that revealed the points about the 2013 inquiry. But what I'd say to him is it's absolutely vital that Peter Wanless, who I think has an excellent record in this regard and will carry out the review in absolutely the right way, that he has all the powers that he needs. And let's be absolutely clear, if he wants more powers, and if that inquiry wants to have a greater powers and ability, it can absolutely ask for it. And as he says, it must go exactly where the evidence leads. We're determined to get to the bottom of what happened.
Ed Miliband.
Agrees, Mr. Speaker. The most important thing in relation to these files is to clarify what actually happened to them and why they went missing. I welcome the overarching inquiry that also has been set up by the Home Secretary. Can the Prime Minister say more about what the terms of reference of that inquiry will be? And can I also ask whether he will consider the very sensible recommendations made today by Peter Wanless around making the covering up of abuse a criminal offence and ensuring that there is an obligation on institutions to report abuse where it occurs?
Well, we're taking the right honourable gentleman's second point first. Should we change the law so that there is a requirement to report and make it a criminal offence not to report? The government is currently looking at that, and of course both reviews will be able to examine this particular point and advise us accordingly, and I think it may well be time to take that sort of step forward. On the issue of the terms of reference of the wider lessons learned review, we're discussing those at the moment. We're very happy to take suggestions from other parties in this House. The main aim here is, as I've said before, you've got a number of inquiries being carried out into specific hospitals, including the Savile inquiries. You've got the inquiry taking place within the BBC and other inquiries, including into Welsh children's homes and elsewhere. What is vital is that the government learns all the lessons of this review. And where I think the Elizabeth Butler-Sloss review can really help is by having a panel of experts that can advise us about all the things that need to change in all of these institutions. For instance, the Church, for instance, the BBC, for instance, the NHS, but also, if necessary, in this place and in government too.
I welcome what he said, and clearly cultural change in this is absolutely crucial in all institutions. I want to turn to another matter, Mr. Speaker, the health service. Last week, the Prime Minister said that waiting times in accident and emergency had gone down, but within 24 hours, the House of Commons Library had called him out. Average A&E waiting times have gone up. Will he now correct the record?
What I said last week at Prime Minister's Questions is absolutely right, and if he goes on the website of the organisation that I quoted from, see it. I also, if you remember, Mr. Speaker, at the end of Prime Minister's Questions, there were some points of order, and I said very specifically that the number of people waiting longer than 18, 26 and 52 weeks to start treatment are lower than they were at any time under the last government. Now, that was directly contradicted by the Shadow Health Secretary, and I just want to give the figures to the House now so people can see that I got my facts right. So, in April 2010, there were 217,000 people waiting over 18 weeks. It is now 186,000, lower. In March 2010, there were 92,000 people waiting 26 weeks for treatment. It is now 59,000, lower. And in terms of waiting 52 weeks for treatment, in April 2010, there were 21,000 people waiting that long. The figure now is 510, lower.
Mr. Speaker, it's very obvious. It's very obvious he doesn't want to talk about what he said on accident and emergency, where the House of Commons called him out. Let's go to the common sense definition of what a waiting time...
Order. As always, doesn't matter how long it takes, the question will be heard, so the braying and the yelling and the calculated heckling might as well cease. We're just going to keep going for as long as it's necessary. Ed Miliband.
Let's go to the common sense definition of what a waiting time in A&E is. It's not how long you wait to be assessed, it's the time between arriving at the A&E and leaving the accident and emergency. And the number of people waiting more than 4 hours, it has its highest level in a decade. Why doesn't he just admit the truth, which everybody in the country knows? People are waiting longer in A&E.
Prime Minister.
The figures I gave last week are absolutely correct, and they are published by the Health and Social Care Information Centre, which is the average waiting time was 77 minutes when the Shadow Health Secretary was Health Secretary. The average waiting time is now 30 minutes. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, we can trade statistics across the floor of the House, and I'm absolutely clear the health service is getting better, but there is a reason why it's getting better, is we took two big strategic decisions. things. We said, let's put more money into the NHS. They said that was irresponsible. And we said, cut the bureaucracy in the NHS, which they wanted to keep. And that is why there are 7,000 more doctors, there are 4,000 more nurses, and he has made a massive mistake keeping a failing health secretary as the shadow health spokesman.
I'd far rather have the shadow health secretary than their health secretary any day of the week. And I'll tell you what's happened in the health service. I'll tell you what's happened in the health service. We had a top-down reorganisation that nobody wanted and nobody voted for, and has diverted billions of pounds away from patient care. And, Mr. Speaker, the contrast we see is between the complacent claims of the Prime Minister and people's everyday experience. People are spending longer in A&E, and hospital A&Es have missed their 4-hour target for the last 50 weeks in a row. Mr. Speaker, while he tries to pretend things are getting better, patients, NHS staff and the public can see it's getting worse right before their eyes.
He still has to defend the man who presided over the mid-staff's disgrace, where standards of patient care were so bad you had patients drinking out of dirty vases because of standards in Labour's NHS. So I'm not taking it. Look, but the point is this. The reason we've been able to cut bureaucracy and the reason we've been able to put more money into the NHS is because we have taken difficult decisions, including having a 1% pay cap in the NHS, which, of course, Labour said they would support, but this week they have decided they will back strikes instead. And, Mr. Speaker, I have here the Labour briefing on strikes, and it says this: do we support strikes? No. Will we condemn strikes? No. There we have it. That is his leadership summed up in one go. Have they got a plan for the NHS? No. Have they got a plan for our economy? No. Is he remotely up to the job? No.
Sir Malcolm
Bruce. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Prime Minister aware that British Airways are to cease the link between Aberdeen and London City in favour of increased services to already well-served airports of Glasgow, Edinburgh and Dublin? Would he support the campaign to maintain this link, which is vital for the vibrant business economy of the north of Scotland?
Well, I'm very happy to look into this issue with the honourable gentleman. It is an absolutely vital service, particularly when you consider how strong the economy in North East Scotland is performing with North Sea oil and gas. So I'm very happy to look at this issue with him.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, tomorrow I'll be in Carmarthen with striking teachers, nurses and firefighters, the backbone of local communities. Aren't his reported plans to ban public sector workers from withdrawing their labour just a cynical attempt to silence opposition to his policies?
Prime Minister.
The point, I'm very clear that I don't think these strikes are right, and I condemn these strikes, and I think that people should turn up for work, and it's a pity we don't have so much clarity on that issue from the party opposite, or indeed from his party. But let me just give one example. The National Union of Teachers is proposing a strike based on a ballot that they had almost 2 years ago on a very small turnout of their members. Now, really, is it right to continue with this situation when so many children's education is going to be so badly disrupted?
Mr. David Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking from the opposition backbenchers on the 9th of December 2002, the Prime Minister said, "I find the European arrest warrant highly objectionable," and my right honourable friend voted accordingly. I still think it is highly objectionable. Does the Prime Minister?
The point I make to my honourable friend is that we have made a series of changes to the European arrest warrant so that you don't have the problem of people being arrested, for instance, for things that aren't a crime in this country. But the question we all have to ask ourselves is, having achieved this vast opt-out from Justice and Home Affairs, which is the biggest return of power from Brussels to Britain, which are those few things we need to go back into in order to fight crime and terrorism? And on this, I think the Home Secretary and the Justice Secretary's judgment has been absolutely right.
And Fluid.
The head of the civil service says that the business case for universal credit has not been signed off. The Department for Work and Pensions says it has. Who is telling the truth?
The budget for universal credit has been signed off in each and every year by the Treasury, and I believe will continue to do so. And the good news on universal credit is that next year we will have 1 in 8 of job centres rolling out universal credit. Now, I thought we'd find that the party opposite would be in favour of a system that makes work pay, but what we can see today is they have gone back into the hole of being against every single welfare change and everything that is getting this country moving.
Maria Miller.
The Safer Internet Centre estimate that up to 30 websites host UK online revenge pornography images, another form of sexual abuse. Does the Prime Minister agree that posting such material has to be recognised for what it is, a criminal sexual offence against its victims?
I think my right honourable friend is absolutely right. This is an appalling offence and a dreadful thing for someone to do, and it clearly has criminal intent, and I'm very glad that she is championing this cause, and I hope that, having looked in detail at the amendments she's suggesting, that we can take up this cause, and it's part of what she achieved in government in terms of making sure we do far more to deal with porn and internet porn, and the very good work that she did in office.
Mr. Nicholas Brown.
If the business case for his universal credit proposals is robust, why is the head of the Home Civil Service saying he hasn't signed it off?
Yeah, good. Prime Minister.
What has happened is that universal credit has been signed off in each and every year by the Treasury. I make no apology for the fact that we are rolling it out slowly. We've learnt the lesson of the last Labour government, in which he played a prominent part, where tax credits were introduced in one go and was a complete shambles.
Mr. Nigel Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The North West Air Ambulance has 3 helicopters and has flown thousands of missions since 1999, one of which saved the life of a friend of mine after a horrific car crash on the M6. It costs £4.2 million a year to run. There are 27 such air services throughout the whole of the United Kingdom, and indeed one of them may soon become a Royal Air Ambulance service. Will he pay tribute to those who man the helicopters, saving lives throughout the country, and also heap praise on the thousands of people who raise funds every week on wet street corners throughout the whole of the United Kingdom to ensure that they carry on flying and carry on saving lives?
No, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Our air ambulances provide a completely invaluable service. I think we should all pay tribute to the men and women who staff and support them, who often have to undertake very difficult landings and takeoffs in order to rescue and get people to hospitals. And he's absolutely right that up and down the country, people are giving charitably in order to fund these vital services.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Speaker, I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree that dealing with terrorism and violence and a commitment to exclusively peaceful and democratic means were fundamental in moving Northern Ireland forward and in taking us from where we were to where we are today. And will the Prime Minister agree that in the Northern Ireland of 2014, Republican threats of violence for political gain must not only be deplored, but that everyone in government, in governmental bodies in Northern Ireland and in the community must stand up against such threats, must commit themselves to fundamental freedoms and upholding democracy and the rule of law?
Prime Minister.
All threats to violence in Northern Ireland are unacceptable and should be condemned on all sides, and I'm very clear about that. What I hope we can achieve in the coming weeks, and it will take compromise and brave decisions on all sides, is to get the Haas talks process ongoing again, with commitments from his own party, as well as from the Ulster Unionist Party, and from Sinn Féin and SDLP, to sit down and discuss these things so we can make some progress. My fear is that if we don't make progress on these issues, you leave space open for extremists on all sides of the debate to start pushing their ideas, which would be deeply unhelpful for the future of Northern Ireland.
Mr. Andrew Bingham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The long-term economic plan is working in my High Peak constituency. Unemployment's down a third in the last year, and as the summer approaches, tourism supports so many jobs in the local economy. I'm walking the boundary of my constituency to promote the area. Can I invite my right honourable friends to consider joining me this August for part of the walk? Well, as promoting the High Peak, I'll be raising money for High Peak Women's Aid, which is a fantastic charity based in Glossop, operated across the whole of the High Peak.
I wish my honourable friend well, and he's making an enticing invitation, and I'm a big fan of what the Peak District has to offer and the very beautiful countryside. I think it is notable that in his constituency the claimant count has fallen by 42% since the election, and the youth claimant count has come down by 39% in the last year. What we're seeing is this economic revival, and we need to stick to our plans to get the deficit down, to help people with tax cuts, to make it easier for firms to employ people, to produce the schools and skills that we need, and to reform our welfare and immigration systems. That is the plan that we must stick to, and it's a plan that's delivering for High Peak.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On GP appointments, a 62-year-old man in Eccles, a carer for his wife who has Alzheimer's, sought an urgent GP appointment for her. This carer was told it would be 5 weeks to see her GP, 2 weeks to see any GP, or he could take her to Salford Royal A&E. If this is the way the NHS treats a carer of a person with dementia, does the Prime Minister not agree it is time to support Labour's plan to give patients like that a right to a GP appointment within 40 years?
First of all, what I say to the Honourable Lady is that there are 1,000 more GPs today than there were when I became Prime Minister. I also think what we are doing is reintroducing the named GP for frail elderly people, which of course Labour got rid of. That is one of the reasons, combined with the disastrous GP contract that Labour introduced, that there is so much pressure on our accident and emergency system. We need to learn from the mistakes that Labour made rather than repeat them all over again.
Sir Alan Beath.
Is the Prime Minister aware that 16 to 18-year-olds in Northumberland who may live 50 miles from a further education college, 20 miles from a high school, are facing charges ranging from £600 a year to several £1,000s a year to get education because the Labour-controlled council has reversed the support given by the previous Liberal Democrat administration? Will he deplore this decision and see what central government can do to promote fair access to education?
Prime Minister! Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and obviously, as he knows, responsibility for transport for education and training rests with local authorities, and clearly this local authority, now controlled by Labour, have made this decision. Of course, we've introduced the £180 million bursary fund to support the most disadvantaged young people, and perhaps that is something that his council and this family could make the most of, but I certainly can combine in agreeing with him that this is another example of the fact that Labour costs you more.
Mr. Keith Vaz.
Mr. Speaker, it is estimated that each day 179 British girls are at risk of being subjected to FGM, joining a total of 170,000 in the United Kingdom who have been cut. Next week he hosts a summit on this issue. Does he agree with me that FGM is not cultural, it is criminal? It is not tribal, it is torture. Will he please read the report of the Select Committee published next Thursday, implement it in full so that we can eradicate this horrendous abuse from our country?
Well, first of all, can I commend the honourable gentleman for the work the Home Affairs Select Committee has done on this issue. I think he's absolutely right that this is a brutal, appalling practice that shall have no place in the world, but should certainly have no place here in Britain, and it's appalling that people living in our country are being subjected to this appalling practice. I will study the report very closely, but the whole aim of the conference, which I am very keen on us holding, is to make sure that these two practices of early and forced marriage and female genital mutilation are wiped out on our planet.
Mr. Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend accept that it would be totally unacceptable to have a statutory limitation on overseas aid without having a similar statutory provision covering defence expenditure to guarantee our NATO commitments?
Well, what I'd say to my honourable friend is that we are in the happy position in this country of meeting the 2% spending on defence, which NATO members are meant to undertake. And when we hold the NATO conference in Wales in September, we should be encouraging other countries to do the same, and indeed to meet some of the new targets for spending on new equipment that can be used in NATO operations, which we certainly meet in this country. But as well as doing that, I think we can also be proud of the fact that we are meeting the promise that we made of spending 0.7% on overseas aid, and that is saving lives all over the world. I wouldn't divorce it from our defence spending, because the money that we spend in places like Somalia or Mali or Nigeria, or indeed in Pakistan, is about reducing the pressures of asylum and immigration and indeed terrorism, making our world safer. That is what our defence budget should be about, and I would argue it's what our aid budget is about as well.
Linda Reardon.
Would the Prime Minister agree that for conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, patients can be out of work for years if they don't get the right treatment? Therefore, NICE should look at the wider benefits rather than just the initial cost of that treatment.
I agree with the Honourable Lady. My understanding is that NICE do carry out that work, but I'll look very closely at the particular condition that she raises and perhaps write to her about NICE's approach to it.
Stephen Phillips.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Businesses across Lincolnshire report growing confidence and lengthy order books. Highly skilled workers benefiting from the tax cuts which this government has introduced, and hard-working apprentices enjoying the sort of opportunities that they couldn't have had just a few years ago. Does the Prime Minister share my assessment that the Shadow Chancellor's plans of borrowing yet more money whilst heaping tax on British businesses and making it more expensive for employers to hire young people are no more and no less than a long-term economic scam?
Friend is absolutely right. What we've got to do is stick to the plan, and that plan involves training young people, and we're on track to hit 2 million apprentices trained under this government. But the very worst thing to do would be to start spending and borrowing and taxing more, which is exactly the proposals made by the opposition.
Sir Kevin Barron.
Will the Prime Minister explain to the House why it is that the only people who feel there's no problems in the National Health Service are members of the Conservative Party?
Minister. Well, what I'd say to the honourable gentleman is every single health system right across the developed world is facing huge challenges and pressures. The pressures of an ageing population, the pressures of new drugs and treatments coming on stream, and the pressures of children surviving with conditions that are going to need to be treated throughout their lives. Now, the question is, how do we respond to those pressures? Now, our response has been to fund the health service and protect it from cuts, and to reform the health service, getting rid of £5 billion of bureaucracy, so there is more doctors, more nurses, and the figures speak for themselves, because you can see more people being treated. That is 1 million more being treated every year in accidents and emergency, 40 million more people getting GP appointments, but it's only because we've taken the difficult decisions that, frankly, Labour have not taken in Wales, and that's why in Wales you see longer waiting lists and real problems with the NHS.
Mark Reckless.
Should taxpayer money be used to gather information on MPs, which is then retained by a chief whip or shredded?
Prime Minister.
If my honourable friend is referring to the situation that took place in the Welsh Assembly, which I was reading about overnight, that does seem to be a very worrying development. If he's referring to something else, he might have to be a bit less Delphic about it and perhaps write to me, and I'll get back to him.
Randy Sawford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister look into the case of a young mum in my constituency who has a significant spinal injury that has left her unable to walk? Her GP has referred her for an urgent appointment with a neurosurgeon. So could the Prime Minister explain to her and the whole country why urgent on his watch means a 4-week wait lying in pain?
Prime Minister.
I will absolutely look at the case that he raises, and I'm always happy to look at individual cases, but the figures I quoted earlier were to demonstrate that when you look at the people waiting 18 weeks, 26 weeks, or indeed 52 weeks, they are lower now, not just than when this government came to office, but they are lower now than at any time under the last Labour government. But I'm very happy to look at the individual case he mentions.
Tessa Munt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Prime Minister aware that since 2012, when he made his promise to increase access for patients to innovative radiotherapy for cancer patients particularly, the number of cancers treated by radiotherapy has actually decreased in some hospitals by 70%, and state-of-the-art machines in our hospitals are lying idle because NHS England won't allow doctors to use them. Can I ask him to meet with me and other cancer cure campaigners like Lawrence Delalio to discuss this scandal before more patients are refused treatment?
I read the report that Dolores Delalio was referring to over the weekend, and I'm very happy to meet with her and indeed with him to discuss this. What we have done is introduce the Cancer Drugs Fund, which is not just for drugs but also for innovative treatment. I know there have been changes as well in the way that radiotherapy is carried out and the new technology that's being used, which may be part of the explanation for the figures that she gives, but I'm very happy to discuss them in more detail.
Albert Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jobs Growth Wales has been a huge success in tackling youth unemployment, outperforming similar schemes across the United Kingdom. Will the Prime Minister therefore join me in congratulating Welsh businesses and enterprises, the Welsh Government and indeed the young people of Wales who have made this a success? And in doing so, he can end his agenda of attacking Wales at every opportunity. And who knows, he might even get a welcome in the hillside.
I want to do everything I can to support economic recovery in Wales, and that is why, for instance, I think that in September, when the NATO conference comes to Wales, which is an entirely initiative launched by me, there'll be a very strong welcome in the valleys, and I'm pleased that this will be, I think, the first time that a serving American president has ever been to Wales, so I'm looking forward to that. We're doing everything we can to help business in Wales to employ more people and to grow the economy.
Question 14, closed question, Mr. Michael Fabricant.
14, sir.
I met with the Chair and the LEP Board on Monday when I hosted a meeting in Birmingham to mark the agreement of a growth deal which will see over £350 million invested in Greater Birmingham and Solihull. The projects in the deal will help to create up to 19,000 jobs, allow up to 6,000 homes to be built and generate up to £110 million from local partners and from private investment.
Mr. Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, sir. With employment just 1.5% in Lichfield and Burntwood, and down by over 28,000 across the whole Greater LEP region, does this not demonstrate that the LEP model, bolstered by those growth funds awarded on Monday, is working? But how does my right honourable friend plan to build on this success and encourage the most ambitious LEPs, which includes the Greater Birmingham and Solihull LEP, to promote the local economy still further?
Minister. As I said at the meeting with the Greater Birmingham LEP, I think the growth deal is a very big step forward for Birmingham and the West Midlands. It will result in more jobs, more investment, more houses. It will see new railway stations, new transport links built. But I think we need to be more ambitious, both in terms of the money we can find in central government to support these schemes, but I also hope local councils, including Birmingham City Council, will look at every piece of unused brownfield land, will look at every extra bit of development they can put on the table so that these growth deals get ever more ambitious.
Steve McCabe.
As bribes go, Mr. Speaker, is offering this huge region less than £10 per head just 37 days before the general election maybe too little, too late?
Prime Minister.
I think you can probably tell the difference between a ray of sunshine and the honourable gentleman on this issue, as on so many others. This is an excellent deal for Birmingham, the West Midlands, and if he doesn't think so, he might want to explain why Sir Albert Bohr, the leader of Birmingham City Council, the Labour leader of Birmingham City Council, said this is good news for Birmingham. A number of major projects will now be accelerated. Transport routes across the city will be improved, and other money will go into site development, which will provide much-needed jobs in the city. I think he needs a bit more time with Sir Albert Bohr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow, Britain faces damage and disruption from strikes, none backed by a majority of union members. Since the Right Honourable Member became leader of the Labour Party, it's taken £13 million from Unite alone, so he's not going to stand up to the union barons. Will the Prime Minister make clear we're on the side of the public, who by 3-1 back a voting threshold for strikes to stop this licensed sabotage?
I think my honourable friend makes a very good point, and frankly I think the time has come for looking at setting thresholds in strike ballots. I mentioned the NUT strike earlier, which was a ballot. It's taking place. Look, I know they're paid for by the unions, but they might want to listen to this because it's going to disrupt our children's education. The strike ballot took place in 2012. It's based on a 27% turnout. How can it possibly be right for our children's education but to be disrupted by trade unions acting in that way? It is time to legislate, and it'll be in the Conservative manifesto.
Order.